The Subcommittee on Workforce Protections will come to order. Welcome, everyone. Good morning. I note that a quorum is present. The committee is meeting today to receive testimony for a two-panel hearing entitled Breathless and Betrayed: What is MSHA Doing to Protect Minors from the Resurgence of Black Lung Disease? Mr. Griffin from Virginia will participate in today's hearing with the understanding that his questions will come only after all members of the Subcommittee on Workforce Protections and the full committee on both sides of the aisle who are present have an opportunity to question the witnesses. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7C, opening statements are limited to the chair and the ranking member. This allows us to hear from our witnesses sooner and provides all members with adequate time to ask questions. I now recognize myself for the purpose of making an opening statement. Today, the subcommittee is going to explore three troubling developments impacting our nation's coal miners and assess whether the administration is making adequate efforts to protect miners' health and economic well-being. First, we will address the resurgence of black lung disease, which has taken the lives of 78,000 coal miners since 1977 and caused suffering in thousands more. Congress codified the first enforceable limit on coal mine dust levels in the 1969 Coal Act, and the rate of black lung disease began to decline in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. More recently, the rate of black lung disease has come back with a vengeance. Nearly 1 in 5 long-tenured miners in Appalachia have been diagnosed with black lung disease. This is 4 times the rate anywhere else. Black lung clinics and researchers at the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, NICHA, have documented a steep increase in the rate of the most severe form of the disease called progressive massive fibrosis, or PMF. PMF, or complicated black lung, is caused by inhalation of coal and silica dust at both underground and surface coal mines. Miners gradually lose the ability to breathe as they wheeze and gasp for air. There's no cure for black lung. It is a progressive disease, and it gets worse with time. We have a chart up that you can look at. Posted on the screen are photographs of 3 sets of lungs. One on the left is a healthy lung with a tan-colored tissue. In the center, the lung with speckled black opacities is from a coal miner with simple black lung disease whose breathing is impaired. On the right, the lung encased in solid black mass is from a miner with progressive massive fibrosis or complicated black lung. For some with PMF, survival requires a lung transplant, but only those healthy enough to withstand the surgery are eligible. Even then, life expectancy does not usually exceed 5 years. Most troubling, PMF is now afflicting miners at far earlier ages. Causes are being documented in miners in their 30s and 40s. As the second slide shows, the rate of PMF declined sharply in the 1970s and kept dropping until the late 1990s, but then progress reversed, and rates now exceed levels diagnosed in the 1970s. Miners' increasing silica exposure has been identified as one of the main causes of the resurgence of PMF. Many of the thickest coal seams in central Appalachia have been mined out, and the seams that remain have coal embedded in quartz-bearing rocks that contain silica. As mining machines grind through thinner coal mine seams, they're cutting quartz and coal together. Miners who inhale this dust are inhaling larger amounts of silica, which is 20 times more toxic than coal dust alone. Let me repeat that. Silica is 20 times more toxic than coal dust. And while the Mine Safety and Health Administration, or MSHA, implemented a more stringent coal dust rule in 2014 under the Obama administration, far more can be done. Serious problems remain to be addressed, and those will be discussed during this hearing today. This much is clear. Black lung is back at epidemic levels. And mine safety regulators and the industry have failed in their jobs to protect miners from this completely preventable occupational disease. Today's hearing will also address the solvency of the Black Lung Disability Trust Fund. When miners are disabled from black lung disease, they can file a claim for black lung benefits with the Department of Labor. If a mine operator shuts down or files for bankruptcy, however, benefits are paid from the Black Lung Disability Trust Fund. That fund is financed by a small tax paid by mine operators on each ton of mined coal. But on December 31, 2018, Congress allowed the tax rate to drop by 55%. If the previous tax rate is not reinstated, the Government Accountability Office projects that the deficit in the trust fund will exceed $15 billion by 2050. While the trust fund can borrow to pay miners benefits and refinance its debt, allowing the tax rate to sunset effectively shifts the cost of black lung disease from the coal industry, which caused the problem, to the taxpayers. And finally, we will examine how black lung claimants could be harmed by the Texas lawsuit that is seeking to invalidate the Affordable Care Act. That suit was brought by Republican attorneys general and supported by the Trump administration. A lower court opinion already struck down the ACA on constitutional grounds, and an appeal is now pending. The Texas litigation not only threatens to eliminate the ACA's protection for people with pre-existing conditions, federal subsidies for low-income people to purchase private health insurance and Medicaid expansion, but repeal would also eliminate the so-called Byrd amendments to the ACA. Those provisions, which are enacted with the support of the Black Lung Association and the United Mine Workers Union, restored important eligibility criteria that enabled miners and their families to receive compensation under the Black Lung Benefits Act. Despite the growing surge of black lung disease, the skyrocketing red ink in the Black Lung Disability Trust Fund, and the threat to miners from the attempt to repeal the ACA, we've heard nothing from this administration about any actions that would protect and defend the threatened health and benefits of this nation's ailing miners. I want to thank our witnesses for their testimony, especially those who have traveled some distance to be here. I also want to give a special thanks to the miners who've traveled from the coal fields of West Virginia. And now I yield to the ranking member, Mr. Byrne, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, for yielding. As the name of this subcommittee suggests, we all share the common goal of keeping hardworking Americans out of harm's way at their jobs. We want to help ensure that all workers return home to their families safe and healthy. Workers in the mining industry have been an extremely important part of the American economy for decades. As someone who comes from a coal mining state, I have been a strong supporter of the men and women who provide for their families by working in this industry. I want us to do everything we can to ensure their safety is protected. As such, it is essential that federal programs designed to provide benefits to these workers are effectively managed to ensure that promised protections and benefits are available now and in the future. The Mine Safety and Health Administration, or MSHA, is responsible for protecting American mine workers by establishing and enforcing safety and health regulations governing all above-ground and underground mines. It is vital that MSHA maintain high standards of safety while also allowing the industry to innovate for the benefit of mine workers and the American economy. In 2018, MSHA reported more than 330,000 Americans were employed by the mining industries. And that same year, the agency reported the second lowest number ever recorded of mining fatalities. However, one fatality is still too many, and we need to continue promoting the best possible policies to ensure a safe and healthy workplace. When discussing the safety of mines, we cannot forget about the hazards whose effects might not be visible until years later in the form of illnesses such as black lung disease. This illness has lasting effects that can devastate workers' bodies and make life more difficult and painful. Today, we will hear from witnesses sharing their stories about some of their hardships. And I want to thank you for being here to provide your testimony. We all share a common goal of preventing and eliminating black lung disease. I look forward to hearing from both panels of witnesses on how we can best accomplish this goal and ensure those already diagnosed with the disease are receiving the proper benefits. I am encouraged by the Trump administration's work in this area and its latest regulatory agenda, which includes a request for information on respirable crystalline silica. It is critical for the agency to determine if the current respirable dust standards are providing the best and most feasible protection for minors. However, I think this hearing is missing a crucial voice in the examination of black lung benefits by not including the director of the Office of Workforce Compensation Program here to testify today. As you know, this committee is responsible for oversight of the OWCP at the Department of Labor, which administers benefits for the Black Lung Disability Trust Fund and plays a key role for minors who are trust fund beneficiaries. Funding for the trust fund, however, is provided by an excise tax on coal. While that excise tax falls under the jurisdiction of a different House committee, the Committee on Ways and Means, it would have benefited everyone in this room to have heard directly from the OWCP so we could have a better understanding of the program. I look forward to the testimony from all the panelists at today's hearing. I believe we can all work together to create common sense, workable, and innovative approaches to ensuring minors have a safe and healthy workplace. With that, Madam Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Byrne. Without objection, all other members who wish to insert written statements into the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically in Microsoft Word format by 5 p.m. on July 5th, 2019. I will now introduce our witnesses for panel one. Our first witness will be Dr. Robert Cohen. Dr. Cohen is a clinical professor in the Department of Environmental and Occupational Health Sciences at the University of Illinois School of Public Health. Dr. Cohen is a leading researcher on occupational lung diseases with a focus in workers affected by mineral dust exposure. Our next witness is Mr. Gary Hairston, who is Vice President of the Fayette County Black Lung Association. Mr. Hairston is a retired coal miner who worked in the mines for 27 years before being forced to leave mining at age 48 due to black lung disease. Since then, Mr. Hairston has been active in fighting to ensure that fellow miners impacted by black lung receive the benefits they are entitled to. Following Mr. Hairston will be Mr. Bruce Watzman. Mr. Watzman, who is testifying without affiliation, was formerly the Senior Vice President for Regulatory Affairs, National Mining Association, and their Chief Regulatory Affairs Officer before retiring last year. Our last witness on panel one will be Mr. Cecil Roberts, President of the United Mine Workers of America. Mr. Roberts is a sixth-generation coal miner and West Virginian. Since 1995, he served 5 terms as president of the UMWA. He started his career as a coal miner and a UMWA member in 1971. We appreciate all of the witnesses for being here today. We look forward to your testimony. And let me remind the witnesses that we have read your written statements, and they will appear in full in the hearing record. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7D and the committee practice, each of you is asked to limit your oral presentation to 5 minutes, a 5-minute summary of your written statement. And let me remind the witnesses as well that pursuant to Title 18 of the U.S. Code Section 1001, it is illegal to knowingly and willfully falsify any statement, representation, written document, or material fact presented to Congress or otherwise conceal or cover up a material fact. Before you begin your testimony, please remember to press the button on the microphone in front of you so that it will turn on and members can hear you. And as you begin to speak, the light in front of you will turn green. After 4 minutes, the light will turn yellow. to signal that you have 1 minute remaining. When the light turns red, your 5 minutes have expired, and we will ask you to please wrap up. We will let the entire panel make their presentations before we move to member questions. When answering a question, please remember to once again turn your microphone on. I will first recognize Dr. Robert Cohen. Dr. Cohen, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman Adams, Ranking Member Byrne, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. My name is Robert Cohen. I'm the director of the Mining Education and Research Center at UIC, the University of Illinois at Chicago. I'm also professor of medicine at the Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine. I direct the Black Lung Center of Excellence and the medical director of the National Coalition of Black Lung and Respiratory Disease Clinics, which has 60 sites across 15 states serving over 13,000 miners. My testimony will cover 3 issues. First, there is a resurgence of severe black lung disease in the United States. Second, overexposure to respirable crystalline silica is an important contributing factor to this resurgence. And third, there are short and long-term policies that MSHA, the Mine Safety Health Administration, should adopt to stem the resurgence of black lung disease. First, evidence of resurgent black lung disease comes from reports of outbreaks of hundreds of cases of progressive massive fibrosis, or PMF, the most severe form of the disease, from former miners attending clinics in Kentucky and southwestern Virginia. Our UIC research group, in collaboration with NIOSH, analyzed national data on former miners applying for federal black lung benefits, and you can see on slide 1 that from 1970 until 1996, the numbers of PMF cases among claimants remained below 2%, but after 1996, this increased dramatically, reaching 8.3% of claims. Shockingly, there have been a total of nearly 2,500 miners determined to have PMF since 1996. Those of us who care for these young miners in our black lung clinics see them fighting for breath. They suffer from the loss of ability to do simple daily tasks like walking to the mailbox, playing with their children and grandchildren, not to mention a loss of their careers, hobbies, and ability to support their families. They suffer from early mortality in spite of our heroic attempts to treat them, including referrals for lung transplantation. Let me remind you there is no cure for this disease. It confers an early death sentence. What is the evidence that silica plays a role? Crystalline silica is present in rock strata above, below, and between coal seams. Mining activities generate freshly fractured, respirable silica, which is highly toxic and causes significantly more lung scarring than coal dust. We see evidence of silica by looking at the number of miners' chest x-rays with large round scars which have been associated with silicosis. The proportion of these miners with these scars has increased in central Appalachia, paralleling the increase of severe disease in these miners. But we could go beyond chest x-ray shadows and look at the lung tissues of miners with PMF. We examined PMF lung tissue from coal miners in the NIOSH National Coal Workers Autopsy Study. On slide 2, you can see that we evaluated the type of PMF, whether it was a coal, mixed dust, or silicotic type, that was present to see how this disease has changed over time. Results from 376 miners showed a significant increase in the silicotic type of PMF from 24% of cases before 1990 to more than 40% after that time. This indicated that miners dying more recently were nearly twice as likely to have silicotic type of disease. Lastly, we see evidence of the role of silica when we look at the mineral particles in the lungs of miners with PMF using the electron microscope and an X-ray probe. Data from the first 8 modern miners and 10 historical comparisons showed that the concentration and proportion of silica particles in lung tissues was nearly double in the modern cases. What can be done? The passage of the new 2014 MSHA dust rule was a significant step forward, but MSHA must go further and sample respirable crystalline silica more frequently than quarterly. NIOSH has developed an in-mine silica analyzer which, paired with a personal quartz monitor, provides rapid estimates of exposure to silica, such as at the end of each shift. Results of monitoring could inform inspectors and operators on the need to change ventilation or place the mine on a reduced dust standard. MSHA should increase the frequency of monitoring for silica until a tamper-proof personal quartz monitor becomes available. In addition, MSHA should adopt the current Occupational Safety and Health Administration permissible exposure limit of 50 micrograms for silica for coal miners. Finally, surveillance must be enhanced for miners working in the hotspots of Central Appalachia. They should be offered more frequent health screening, including chest X-ray and spirometry testing every 2 to 3 years rather than every 5 years. Thank you for the opportunity to provide this testimony, and I'll be pleased to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you. We'll now recognize Mr. Harrison. You are recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Chairman Adams, Ranking Member McBride, and Subcommittee, I'd like to thank you for letting me be here today. My name is Gary Hurston. I worked in the coal mine for 27 and a half years. I'm the Vice President of the Fayette County Black Lung Association. I just want to thank you for this opportunity to speak here today. I work for Westmoreland Coal Company for 27. I worked for the Westmoreland Coal Company. That's where I started, at Westmoreland. I was 21 years old when I went there. I was a trainee, a redhead they call us. I worked for Westmoreland 8.5 years. I worked for Maben Energy for 13 years. I worked for Maben Energy for 13 years as at Brushy Gap and Stony Gap as a scoop operator and electrician. I worked 6 years with Massey Coal Company as an electrician and working on belts. At the mines, there was plenty of dust. Maben Energy was the worst. I tell you, the dust there, you couldn't even see when you run the equipment, you couldn't even see where you're really going. Thank you. I tell you what, it was so bad at Maben Energy that we didn't even hang curtains. The only time we hung curtains when we know an inspector was coming, or he was around the mine. And on top of that, we had to put our dust samplers in good air. We couldn't put them where the dust was at, so we wouldn't get a bad sample. At Massey also, it was plenty of dust where I was working at. But there, the only time I really in the worst dust was when I was in the return, had to work on equipment while the mountain was operating. They wouldn't shut down. They wouldn't put the mountain in good air. They put them in the place where they can keep running coal. I was 48 years old when I had to quit work. I couldn't even play with my grandkid. Then I had to watch my wife go out of the house and start to work, help us make ends meet at our house. You don't know how that feel when you bought up and you supposed to take care of your house. And you see your wife go out to take care of it. I never did think at a young age that I wouldn't be able to take care of my family. But I'm really here to talk about two things today. As for the Black Lungs Association and the men with black lungs, we're here to try to get something done about it. First thing is the excise tax on coal, and intended to pay the cost of running the black lung program, and to pay the black lung benefit for miners like me. When the coal company go bankrupt, it's up to the federal black lung black lung benefit to start taking over, where the coal company just quit paying when they found bankrupt. They ain't got to pay no more black lung to us. We got to be turned over to the federal government. After 32 years, Congress allowed the more than half of the excess tax to expire in January, so now the excess tax is only 50 cents, still $1.10. 25 cents a ton on surface mining, where it was 50 cents. According to the government's accounting office, this decrease will cause the Black Lung Disability Trust Fund to reach a debt of $15.4 million. in 2050. And the coal company ain't worried about it paying no more because then it'll be turned over to the taxpayers. Y'all be paying for what the company should be paying for. Especially at the time when more coal miners getting black lungs, and they taking all of it. The coal companies that don't want to pay nothing, they turn the excess tax over to the people. Oh, our second concern was the effort of the Attorney General at the Trump administration at the current before Act through the court because of the act continues to amendment. I'm sorry. I'm just upset.
Harrison, we're going to ask some questions when we finish, so thank you for your testimony, and
Thank y'all for
I
letting
am
me
just,
speak.
you know, very, very compassionate about all that you've been through. So we thank you for just being here today and sharing your story.
Thank you.
Okay? All right, we will now hear from Mr. Walterman. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you today to share my views based on almost 4 decades of experience working on issues related to miner safety and health. In December 2018, I retired from the National Mining Association following a 37-year career. During my career, I was primarily responsible for representing the industry on issues impacting the health and safety of our nation's coal miners, including issues related to the federal Black Lung Program. During my career, I served as a member of the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health Mine Safety and Health Research Advisory Committee and participated as a member on numerous NIOSH and MSHA partnerships formed to address specific safety and health issues. The views expressed today are solely mine. They do, however, reflect positions the industry has advanced to improve miner safety and health. I was involved in the development of those positions, and I believe they would, if enacted, result in safety and health improvements beyond those we've already achieved. At the outset, let me be clear. If we had the ability to turn back the hands of time to prevent the suffering that has been reported, I can assure you that the industry would have already done so. Unfortunately, this cannot be done, but what we can and must do is to ensure that 10, 15, or 20 years from now, there will be no more suffering, nor the need for another hearing because lung disease among coal miners will have been eradicated. The disease that's being reported on today results from exposures that occurred 10 to 20 years ago. It does not reflect the improvements of MSHA's new dust rule, and the impacts of that will not be known for many years to come. What is needed today is to ensure that the actions MSHA has already taken and those being contemplated are based on sound science, reflect a complete understanding of the relationship of exposure and disease, provide mine operators the ability to utilize all tools available to protect the workforce, and most importantly, are protective of miners' health. During my career, I was privileged to work with many talented individuals in industry and academia who work day in and day out to ensure that every miner returns safely to his or her loved ones, and who upon their retirement would be able to enjoy the fruits of their labors. Much success has occurred. Injury and fatality rates are down. But what was missed, and everyone bears some responsibility, is that we ignored certain warning signs that should have caused us to broaden our examination of the emerging increases in black lung disease. I recall several meetings I attended with people within NIOSH and others where early warning signs were indicated. We talked about rapid progression CWP in a meeting with NIOSH. We sought additional information so we could further examine it when I was part of the industry. Unfortunately, the requests were denied due to HIPAA concerns. We talked about the clustering that has occurred in southern Appalachia, the area which has become characterized as the hotspot region, because of keen interest of the cases of PMS were being diagnosed following a latency period far shorter than traditional coal workers' pneumoconiosis. It was following this that researchers, including those at NIOSH, began to identify silica as the culprit, resulting in these cases of early onset disease. During this same time, we worked collaboratively with NIOSH and MSHA in the development of the Personal Continuous Dust Monitor. I will tell you that is a game changer as it relates to dust sampling in the industry. But as reliable as the CPDM is in measuring coal dust concentrations, it unfortunately does not provide real-time silica sampling. A renewed effort to develop a real-time silica monitor must be a priority. But there are additional things that must be done. We must change so that mandatory surveillance, mandatory X-ray surveillance, is applied across the industry. We have no baseline understanding today of the prevalence of the disease because only approximately 1/3 of the miners participate in the X-ray surveillance program. Without that basic information, employers can't work with their employees to help them during their working career. In tandem with this, the Part 90 program that MSHA administers must be changed. Exercising a Part 90 right under the law is at the discretion of miners. Studies have shown that only approximately 15% of the miners exercise this right to be moved to a less dusty workplace at no loss of pay. The law needs to be changed to accommodate that. Thirdly, the use of administrative controls and personal protection must be recognized for mining. It's recognized in other industries, and it's long overdue for mining. Madam Chairman, I thank you for the time. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, sir. We'll now recognize Mr. Roberts. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, for this opportunity, and also Ranking Member Byrne. My name is Cecil Roberts. I'm President of United Mine Workers. I've represented coal miners now for 42 years. Prior to that, I was a coal miner for 5.5 years. In my career, I've worked closely with the medical community, particularly Dr. Cohen, and before him, Dr. Rasmussen, who is revered in the coal fields of southern West Virginia. And unfortunately, he's passed away. I've also worked with the Black Lung Associations, and let me just comment on my friend, Mr. Hairston. I want to thank him for his courage to come here today, suffering from pneumoconiosis and having the courage to testify before this committee. I've also worked with all of the clinics throughout the coal fields, and I'm a board member of the Cabin Creek Clinic in southern West Virginia. So I'm a native West Virginian, and I come here with a vast amount of time that I've spent on this issue. And I must say, in all due respect and honesty, the views of workers in the coal fields are not good with respect to how they've been treated by their government, whether it's on the state level or the federal level. And I don't have to point very much further than how we got the first act that protected coal miners in 1969. It took 159 years, by the way, before this government decided they ought to try to keep miners safe. And that was when the first law was passed in 1969. It would not have passed in 1969, Madam Chairman and members of this committee, if 78 miners had not lost their lives at Farmington in northern West Virginia in a blink of an eye, and all the widows and all their friends gathered around that mine portal, shown on television in 50 states in the United States of America. That would never have happened if the country had not witnessed this. Along with the passage of health and safety language, we got the first recognition, about the first time, in 1969, after 159 years, the first time that anyone in this government said there was such a thing as pneumoconiosis. For years and years, there's been a denial that there was such a thing. Miners knew they were sick. Miners were dying in their 40s. They thought they had something called miner's asthma because the medical community never identified it as an occupational illness, and neither did their government. So there's a long, tough history here. It wasn't long after the passage of this act, in the 80s, there was vast fraud throughout this coal industry. Over 500 companies were cited for fraud, taking samples of miners who worked for them. and over 4,000 citations issued. That wasn't the first time this happened. This has happened repeatedly throughout history. I want to go quickly, Madam Chairman, because I don't want to just talk about this problem. I want to talk about some solutions here, and I'm beginning on page 56 of my very lengthy testimony that we have submitted. We suggest that Congress needs to take necessary action, number one, to require the Federal Mine Safety and Health Administration to assume the responsibility for conducting respirable dust sampling. We can no longer allow coal companies to do this. That's like me calling up the police and say, I'm speeding on 79, and it saves a lot of money, but I'm not going to do that, and the coal industry can no longer be responsible for administering the protections these miners need about what kind of dust they're exposed to. Remember, it's the coal companies that take these samples, and there's a long history of fraud here. Number two, Congress needs to take the action to require the Federal Mine Safety and Health Administration to promulgate an emergency temporary standard that creates a permissible exposure limit for silica. Dr. Cohen spoke to this. We can all come here today and act like we need some more time, but coal miners don't have any time. They're dying in West Virginia, and they're dying in Kentucky, and they're dying in Virginia, and they don't have any more time to wait here. We need an exposure limit for how much silica you can be exposed to. Number three, Congress needs to take the necessary action to require the Federal Mine Safety and Health Administration to promulgate an emergency temporary standard that expands the walk-around rights to allow coal miners to be part of this sampling. They're not part of this. Only the coal companies take these samples. So coal miners need to be part of this. Number four, Congress needs to take the actions that is necessary to address the problem of miner representation and participation not represented by organized labor. Organized labor, we take care of this ourselves because of our contract, but non-union miners don't have these protections. Number five, Congress must take immediate action to restore and increase the funding stream necessary to pay for benefits owed to coal miners from the Black Lung Disability Trust Fund. With that, Madam Chairman, I would just point out that I presented to this committee a lengthy presentation of every committee that's ever been established in this Congress to deal with this and have failed to do so. So I hope today that we take some action to protect these miners. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I thank all of you for your testimony. Under Committee Rule 8A, we will now question witnesses under the 5-minute rule. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Hairston, thank you again for being here. Thank you for your courage. Can you describe to us how you discovered that you have black lung and PMF?
First time I realized I was outside working on a piece of equipment. It started raining. I ran up some steps. When I got in the bathhouse, I couldn't breathe. I'm thinking I'm getting ready to die. But I didn't pay that no attention. I just kept on working. And I was in the mine by myself one time, up on the section, carrying the oxygen tank out of the mine. And when I got down to where I needed to take it out on the track, I'm sitting there laying there, couldn't hardly breathe, trying to figure out, it's in about on 5 me or I'm out the way. Somebody, my wife tell them I didn't make it home. Then I got pneumonia. And when I went to the hospital, they seen a mass on my lung. They thought it was cancer. But they couldn't find out it was black lung after they did a biopsy on it. They showed they was complicated black lung.
Okay, so can you describe for us what it's like to have this disease, and can you tell me a little bit about what's happening to the miners that you worked with?
When you can't do what you want to do, when you want to do something with your kids and you can't, and I'm keeping one of my grandsons now that I can just watch him play ball, and I can't even help him. Even when I try to do work, I got to go at a pace. And looking at all the other coal miners, some of them is in worse shape than I am. And some of them, they pretty much can't even walk 10 foot before they got stopped and started resting.
Okay, so can you tell me, when you worked in the mines, did the mine operators game the system by keeping samplers out of the dust? And what happened when MSHA inspectors arrived at that time?
Yes, at the one mine I worked at, we didn't hang curtain until the inspector came. And most of the time, even with the dust sampler, we either covered the hole up, or when the inspector was on the section, we covered the hole up till he come around, then we pulled the tape off of it, so it wouldn't take the dust up. Yet the boss told us not to get no bad sample, but I knew it came from the high up than the boss. So we did everything we could to keep from getting better sample, because if we got a better sample, they recommended us, or they say if we didn't do better, we had to worry about them trying to get rid of us.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Cohen, the mining industry and Misha have argued that the alarming rise in black lung and PMF that we're seeing now is a result of exposures 10 years ago, and things may have changed for the better. They caution that it might be too early to take any action. And how would you respond to that? And should we just wait 10 years, or do we have enough evidence from the research that you and others have done to act today?
I believe we have the obligation to act today, and the evidence shows that the case numbers are still rising. We don't have any evidence that that's plateauing or that that's stopping. And I think that we'd be doing a huge disservice to wait until we have another generation of miners with this disease to get data from the new rules. And as we talked about, the new rule really doesn't address silica, which is really a huge part of this problem in the way that we need to.
Thank you, sir. I want to now recognize the ranking member for the purpose of questioning the witnesses.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Mr. Waltzman, in your testimony, you discussed the fact that MSHA does not recognize work practices or personnel protection equipment as tools to reduce a miner's exposure to dust. Do you think if MSHA were able to recognize these measures today, it could help to mitigate health risks such as black lung disease? And if so, could you explain why?
Well, I do believe that. The traditional ways of limiting dust exposure in the mines is through air and water. And there's only so much air and water we can bring into the mines before that in and of itself creates unintended hazards. If we had the ability to use personal protection, there are devices that are used in other industries that provide a continuous stream of clean air over the miner's breathing zone. Those are used on occasion voluntarily provided by operators, but they're not recognized by MSHA. Similarly, the ability to rotate miners who are exposed to high concentrations of dust so that they're not exposed to the full shift. Again, this is a practice that's used in other industries. It's recognized in other industries, but the Mine Safety and Health Administration regulations, as they're written today, don't recognize those practices.
You also mentioned in your testimony that MSHA's regulations should allow for worker rotation programs you just mentioned. Further, if you don't mind, further explain how this works and why this could help offer additional protections to miners.
Sure, let's talk about a miner who's running a continuous miner. That's a machine that's cutting the coal, one of the highly designated concentration areas in a mine. Rather than exposing that miner during a full shift, if it's an 8-hour shift, rotating provides the ability for the operator to change out 2 individuals during the shift, so that during the second half of the shift, the miner who was operating the machine during the first 4 hours, let's say, is then moved to a less dusty part of the mine to perform other job functions. So you're limiting the time that the miner is exposed to the areas where there may be high concentrations of dust.
It sounds like the NIOSH X-ray surveillance program has real potential to allow us to get a better understanding of the prevalence and severity of black lung disease. We all want to see the eradication of the disease. Should we consider making the X-ray program mandatory? Is there pushback on making this mandatory?
Well, I would say it should be mandatory, and that should be a priority. It should be done tomorrow. Today, only 1/3 of the miners participate in the X-ray surveillance program. We don't have a full understanding of the severity or the incidence of disease across the industry. But more importantly, is that without participation in that program, we don't know what the miners' health status is during their working career. If we had that information and it was shared with the operators could work with the miners to help them during their working career, to move them to less dusty parts of the mine. Right now, we have a pre-employment physical. There is an X-ray that's required. There is a follow-up X-ray that's required 3 or 5 years later. And then there is no requirement during the remainder of the miner's working career. This is really a health issue. It's really having more information available to help the miner during their working career.
And I asked, is there pushback to this?
Well, I think there are others on the panel who that question would be more appropriately addressed to. But I can tell you that in the occasions when I was working for the industry and we raised this issue, there was pushback. I couldn't understand it because we were addressing this from solely a health issue, but there was pushback.
Well, I'll go ahead and open it up then. Is there anybody on the panel that wants to push back against the suggestion Mr.
I do.
Walshman made? Okay. Yes, sir, please.
Reason the coal miners don't get no X-ray because they scared. If they go get an X-ray when the dogs come around, they'll fire them. So they're scared to take that test. So they won't go take them.
All right, Mr. Walshman, you want to respond to that?
Well, there are protections that are already written in the law. You can't discriminate against a miner. You move a miner under Part 90 to a less dusty environment at no loss of pay. There are discriminatory protections in the law. If they're not adequate, then they should be looked at. But I think we need to get to the point where all miners are participating in this program so that we can address their health considerations during their working career.
Thank you. I appreciate your testimony. I yield back.
Thank you very much. We'll now recognize Mr. Takano from California. 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Chairwoman Adams, for this very important hearing on mine safety standards and the urgent need to protect miners from exposure to dangerous levels of silica. Research has shown that silica dust lodges in the lungs forever. Forever. And we know this. I can barely contain my anger by certain people coming before this committee. It is much more toxic than coal dust. In 2016, OSHA updated their silica standards and lowered the permissible exposure level. And even with this information, the MSHA silica standards still have not been updated. And we know this. Mr. Harrison, I understand why people who are desperate for their jobs, who may not know what's in the law, who may be unprotected by labor unions, wouldn't want to have those x-rays done. Miners have reported that cutting rock was like being in a room full of smoke or sitting on a cloud. We can't afford to wait another 10 years to address this epidemic. Miners would not be dying at these drastic levels if there was effective regulation and strong federal enforcement. I'm hopeful that this hearing will shed light on the issue and help us come up with effective strategies to protect miners. Dr. Cohen, if MSHA were to require the use of end-of-shift monitoring equipment at all mines, what effect would that likely have on worker exposure, assuming the mine operators did not game the results?
I think there's no doubt that it would reduce exposure. It would identify tasks that are generating huge amounts of this toxic respirable crystalline silica. You might be entering a seam that has silica within there, cutting rock, rooftop, or cutting other things that would generate a lot of silica. I think it would help them change their practices and reduce exposure.
How would mines respond to that information?
I think that they would then be able to use the engineering controls that are available. I think that you can with water and with ventilation. I think it's very possible to reduce dust levels. And I think that those engineering controls could be implemented, enforced, changed, organized in such a way as to reduce the exposure for these miners, or other alternatives could be done. I think that information would be very useful in a very practical time period.
What changes could they make if they identified high exposures at the end of the shift?
Then the next shifts that are working would be able to institute these ventilation changes or institute other practices that would reduce those exposures.
Dr. Cohen, how certain are you that silica is responsible for the spike in black lung diseases and black lung cases, particularly progressive massive fibrosis or complicated black lung? How certain are you?
I'm very certain. I think the evidence is very strong.
What evidence do you have that would allow you to conclude that silica is the right culprit?
Well, I think that we have evidence on 3 levels. We have the X-ray evidence that I spoke of, the pattern of disease that's associated with silica. We now have pathology case series and a larger series of pathology where we're looking at the tissue to see what is the particle in the tissue. And finally, we're actually examining at the particle level what is the percentage and concentration of silica. So we're amassing evidence on many levels that silica is an important part of this problem.
Thank you, Dr. Cohen. Mr. Harrison, thank you so much for being here and sharing your story. And I applaud you for your advocacy and the work that you do to help other miners. Can you speak to what changes miners and mine operators could make if they have identified high silica exposure at the end of a shift? What changes could they make?
Not too much, but I'm telling you, when you work 9 to 10 hours a day, you don't get out of dust exposure. If they cut back on the hours that you work and cut back on how many days you work a week, it would help it more than almost anything because your lungs get a chance to clear out. The way you work now, that your lungs don't never get a chance to clear.
What do you recommend that MSHA and Congress do to ensure that silica exposure is reduced for miners? What are your thoughts about that?
The water and having the air right, it would help a lot. And that'll be one of the things, to try to get enough water and air up there to try to push the dust out. That would help a lot, to try to keep from getting the exposure of it.
Well, thank you, Mr. Harrison. I appreciate your courage in being here today, and I'm sorry you're suffering from this terrible, terrible work-related disease.
Thank you.
Appreciate your time. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. We're going to yield to Mr. DeSanya of California. 5 minutes, sir. Ms. Stevens is recognized.
Are you going to recognize the ranking member?
She's not ready for that yet.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm delighted to be at this hearing in this moment. I'm from Michigan, and I ran for the seat because we wanted to stand up for the hardworking men and women of this country and our labor movement. I asked to get on this committee for the very reason of what we are discussing here today, this subcommittee around workforce protections and the inalienable rights that include not dying on the job. After declining since the 1970s, black lung disease among today's coal miners is back with a vengeance. It's affecting more than 1 in 5 miners in central Appalachia, and these rates are just clearly higher than they were in the 70s. This is alarming and should immediately trigger the swift involvement of our federal government to allocate the resources and bring all stakeholders to the table. Dr. Cohen, I wanted to ask you what some of the improvements that Congress can do to build upon the Obama administration's repairable dust rule might be. And if you don't mind, maybe kind of talking a little bit about that with the rule and why it hasn't been implemented and what we could do, we'd appreciate it.
Right. I think that the silica standard for MSHA was sort of on the regulatory agenda towards the end of that administration, but time ran out and they were not able to get that enacted. But I think we have an incredibly well-researched and well-documented OSHA standard for silica. Silica dust is the same whether it's a construction worker digging a tunnel versus a miner digging a tunnel. It's the same toxic material. There's no difference depending on which regulatory agency is covering that worker. So it makes no sense whatsoever that we have one standard that's part of a complex formula that doesn't seem to be effective, and another standard that's very straightforward, 50 micrograms per meter cubed, action levels of 25 micrograms per meter cubed. Let's take care of this, and it was a very long 40-year process to get that standard. We should just adopt it for minors.
Thank you. Mr. Roberts, thank you for your leadership. The mine workers, you're an incredible leader, and we're glad that you're here. What are some of the missed opportunities happening now that are holding us back from preventing more cases of black lung from affecting the young workers? I think Takano kind of touched on this, but if you could just dive in a little bit deeper for us, particularly from your vantage, we'd appreciate that.
I think it would be helpful for the committee to understand that when you have PMF, the most severe form of black lung, the cure for that is a lung transplant. That's it. Cost $1 million each, and you live about 3 years. So that's the cure. So we're now debating whether we should do something about this, right? So, and I don't mean to be overly critical, but sometimes I can't help myself after being here so many times over the years. First of all, we've got to place in the hands of coal miners more power. They have absolutely no idea at the time they're being tested for the exposure to dust, how much they're in. The new system helps with that. If you had a system that we just discussed about end-of-shift silica readings, there's no guarantee that they'll know what that reading is. And the third thing about that is there is no standard. So until we have a standard that these companies have to meet, we're doing absolutely nothing by having the end-of-shift review of this, because coal companies will make the decisions about whether or not they want to do something about the amount of silica that's being presented to miners who are working in the mines. So we have to have more power to the miners, more rights to the miners, and we've got to take this system out of the hands of the people who operate the mines. And I'm not here suggesting that all coal companies are bad. I'm on record here in Congress that most coal companies want to do the right thing. But as I just pointed out originally, there's a lot of coal companies that do not.
Well, and there's certainly a lot of issues where it's easy to point the finger, but that doesn't necessarily solve the problem.
That's
And so
correct.
what you're talking about with standards, as someone who also sits on the House Science Committee with oversight of the National Institute of Standards and Technologies, we know very well the importance of what standards will bring to this, the justice, and frankly, the health outcomes. I do a lot of hearings. I can't think of a more important hearing around the general health outcomes and the protections of our workers. So you mentioned you've been here a lot, that you've been having this conversation on repeat. I want to let you know it's a new day in this Congress with new
Gentlelady's
leadership.
out of time.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. We'll now recognize Dr. Fox from North Carolina, the ranking member of Ed and Labor.
Thank you, Dr. Adams. And I want to thank our panel members for being here today. Mr. Watsman, mining is a vital part of the American economy, and mine workers deserve a workplace that ensures their basic health and safety. One factor that's so difficult with black lung disease is the latency period between a worker being exposed to dust and the onset of the disease. In your view, are we able to know if the recent MSHA standard, the 2014 respirable coal mine dust rule, is providing workers with the needed protection? And based on information currently available, what actions, if any, should we be considering today?
I don't think we have enough information yet. The rule came into place in 2014. We have fully implemented across the industry the continuous personal dust monitor. That information is provided to the Mine Safety and Health Administration electronically. It's tamper-proof protected when it's shared. And based upon the information that MSHA has reported, dust levels across the industry are down dramatically. That's a step in the right direction. but I think we need to learn more over time in terms of whether this is effective or not. You know, it's unfortunate because of the latency period that it takes so long to understand the effectiveness. And when the National Academy of Sciences recently issued their report on respirable dust, they pointed to that because of the latency period, and it's not my words, it was their conclusion, that because of the latency period, we really don't know whether or not dust standards are effective in a short enough period of time. So it is a problem, but I'm not sure that there's much we can do to overcome that because of the 10 to 20-year latency period before disease presents itself.
Thank you. Mr. Watsman, you've been actively engaged in the mining industry and have worked with MSHA for over 30 years. How would you characterize the way the agency identifies priorities and addresses concerns? The title of today's hearing implies the agency has been willfully ignoring its duties. Based on your experience, is this the case?
I don't think that's a fair characterization, quite honestly. I think the agency does as good a job as it can working with its stakeholders to identify priorities. They inherited a dust rule from the prior administration. They are implementing that dust rule, enforcing that dust rule from the prior administration. They haven't turned their backs on that issue. They haven't revised the dust rule. They haven't proposed revisions, as far as I know right now, to those underlying standards. So I think that they do a good job. Could they do a better job? I'm sure we could all point at organizations who could do a better job working with their stakeholders, but I don't think it's a fair characterization to say that they've turned their back on the miners.
Thank you again. Mr. Watsman, we all want to see the elimination of advanced lung disease related to mining activities while preserving jobs that are vital to these workers and their communities. It is clear the mining industry has continued to evolve and improve practices over the years as new information and technologies become available. How can we continue to encourage and facilitate the creation of additional new technology moving forward?
Well, there's a barrier that needs to be overcome. There are technology providers who provide technology outside the U.S. but aren't bringing it into the U.S. This is an issue that the Assistant Secretary talked about early in his tenure. We need to come up with better procedures to get new technologies introduced, especially in the underground coal environment. MSHA has a very rigorous, time-consuming, and expensive approval and certification process. We need to recognize where technology is approved by international standard-setting organizations, that approval should be adequate for introduction into the U.S., and I hope that the agency's moving in that direction.
Thank you, Mr. Watsman, and again, I want to thank the panelists for being here today. I yield back, Madam Chairman.
Thank you very much. We'll yield now to the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Weil.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Hairston, good morning. I'm sorry that I wasn't here for the oral testimony portion, but I have read your written testimony, and I appreciate it. In a letter from November of 2018, Hal Quinn, the National Mining Association CEO, stated that the, quote, industry is committed to ensuring that all miners who suffer from black lung receive the benefits they deserve, end quote. And in your experience, I'd like to ask you, which includes working as a coal miner for 27 years before you were diagnosed, and as Vice President of the Fayette County Black Lung Association, would you agree or disagree with Mr. Quinn's statement that the industry is committed to ensuring that all miners who suffer from black lung receive the benefits they deserve?
I disagree.
So that hasn't been your experience?
No.
Can you tell us a little bit about your experience in terms of the benefits that you believe you should have received that you haven't?
When I filed for mine, the company waited to the last minute to even protest it. Then I think we fought mine for 2 years, and at the Washington Lee University wanted to help me get mine. And most coal miners, most of them try 10, 15 years before they ever get it. They always find some kind of way. At one time, they would hide the x-rays, knowing that they had it. They get the expensive hospitals to say that you ain't got it. So it ain't helping us.
Let me stop you there for a second, because I want to go to Dr. Cohen and ask Dr. Cohen about, well, before I get to Dr. Cohen, let me go to Mr. Watsman. In June of 2018, there was a Reuters article on the resurgence of black lung disease and the coal industry's opposition to maintaining the tax rate that supports the Black Lung Disability Trust Fund. And you were quoted as saying, "More often than not, we are being called upon to provide compensation for previous or current smokers." Mr. Watsman, can you explain that comment to Mr. Hairston or any of his work colleagues that jeopardize their health for the benefit of the coal industry? And specifically, can you provide us with any credible medical or scientific study that backs up your claim that smoking is the root cause of coal miners becoming disabled and therefore qualifying for black lung benefits?
I don't have it with me, but I will provide a study for the record that I am familiar with for your benefit.
Who authored that study, Mr.?
I can't recall off the top of my head.
And it's your position that that study supports the claim that smoking is the root cause?
I didn't say that it was the root cause.
Well, that was my question. So you don't have any evidence that smoking is the root cause of coal miners becoming disabled?
No, I didn't. No, I don't.
Okay, thank you. In addition, in June of last year, the National Mining Association distributed a fact sheet to congressional offices that asserted that there was a, quote, decline in medical black lung disease, and that the reduced black lung excise tax rate was more than sufficient to provide monthly disability payments. First of all, question, did you review and approve that fact sheet before it was distributed?
I was not solely responsible for it, but I would have been involved in its development at that time.
Okay. Dr. Cohen, I'd like to turn to you. Do you care to comment on that statement that there's been according to the National Mining Association's fact sheet to congressional offices, that there has been a decline in medical black lung disease?
Yeah, I think that's wrong.
And can you tell us what your evidence reveals?
We have evidence from active working coal miners that's part of the NIOSH Coal Workers Health Surveillance Program that shows that the rate of disease on chest x-rays is increasing. We have evidence from former miners that are applying for black lung, including outbreaks from clinics, and then a review of national data from the Office of Workers' Compensation Program's Black Lung Benefits Program that clearly shows that the rates of severe disease and compensated workers is increasing.
And can you give us can you quantify that at all?
Well, I think that one of the most shocking numbers that from 1996 to the present, 2,500 miners have been compensated for disabling progressive massive fibrosis, the most severe form of the disease. And that curve I showed a bit earlier shows that it's just a very steep increase, as opposed to what we would really hope for is that under modern dust controls that we'd be decreasing and eliminating this disease.
Thank you. Mr. Hairston, I hope that our committee will be able to do something to help you all. With that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. I'll now yield to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Wright. You recognize 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. First, Mr. Hairston, I was here earlier for your opening testimony, and it was very compelling, and no one can know fully what you've been through unless they've had that disease, so God bless you and your family. I know it's been tough. Mr. Watsman, I wanted to ask you, because this hearing kind of underscores the difficulty that Congress has in implementing any kind of new regulation or anything like that when you have this time lapse that's been discussed here. If we look at car accidents over the last 30 years, it's going to include an awful lot of accidents before cars had airbags, for example. And so my first question to you is, how do we get a handle on this, realizing that there's been an awful lot of improvements made in the last 25, 30 years, and yet we don't have the data to know exactly what the effect of that's going to be until we're further down the road. Is there any data that is more recent that can be applied to this?
Well, we have data that becomes available as the NIOSH X-ray surveillance program, as minors participate in the NIOSH X-ray surveillance program, and that data becomes available. But again, that's only a fraction of the workforce, and that's the problem, that we're looking at 30 to 35% of the workforce. And human nature, at least as it relates to me, tells me that if I'm not feeling well, I go see my physician. But if I'm feeling well, I have no need to go to the physician. Yet, there may be an underlying disorder that I'm not aware of. And that's why we feel so passionately as an industry, or the industry feels so passionately, and I still feel that I'm a part of it, that the X-ray surveillance program should be made mandatory, so that there is a better understanding of the breadth of disease across the entirety of the industry, and so that operators can work with their employees to take action to protect them during the remainder of their working career.
And you hit on another point when you mentioned percentages, because while percentages may be up, the total number of minors is down. And so if you're going to do an accurate comparison with the past, it needs to be an apple and apple comparison, not an apple and orange comparison. So,
correct.
Right. So I just want to throw that out there, that if we're going to be making these comparisons over time, then they need to be relevant comparisons. You don't apply, you can talk all day long about how the percentage is up, but if the total number is different, then it's gonna skew the conclusion. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
All right, thank you very much, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. I'll now yield to the Chair of Education and Labor, Chairman Scott from Virginia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. President Roberts, you're aware of the reporting by Howard Burkus of National Public Radio about the epidemic of progressive massive fibrosis that really brings us here today. And your testimony calls for an emergency temporary standard for a more protective silica standard. Does your testimony call for the same standard that NIOSH has been recommending for 40 years?
I think the standard that was promulgated by OSHA would be the standard that I would encourage this committee to take into consideration as they deliberate this issue. If I could just elaborate slightly, you do not really need to wait 10 years to determine when a miner's been in the mines 5 years and he has PMF, that you might want to wait another 10 years because that miner's going to be gone.
Well, the Mine Safety Health Administration, the MSHA, has the authority to issue an emergency standard when it determines that miners are exposed to a grave danger from exposure to substances or agents determined to be toxic or physically harmful. Are miners exposed today to that grave danger?
Oh, absolutely. They're exposed to grave danger as we're sitting here today.
Thank you. Dr. Cohen, we've heard reference to the 2014 improvement. What improvements on the silica standard were made by that 2014 standard for mine workers?
There was no specific improvement in the silica standard in the 2014 regulations. The total dust was lowered from 2 milligrams to 1.5.
Well, I thought you said that silica was causing the problem of progressive massive fibrosis.
It is.
And so the 2014 change didn't have anything to do with silica, is that right?
I don't believe that it addressed it adequately, no.
Now, it's my understanding, Dr. Cohen, that NIOSH has been recommending a better standard, the same standard that applies now with OSHA, but not mine workers. Is that right?
That's my understanding, yes.
Okay. What has happened for 40 years?
I think that it was a long process to get the new OSHA standard through, and that finally was passed. And I think that it's just absolutely nonsensical that that doesn't apply to minors as well. They're workers exposed to the same dust. So I think that that has to be done and should be done, and the data is there for that.
Mr. Harrison, you talked about the reluctance to get x-rays. Why are people afraid to get x-rays?
They're scared of getting fired.
And why would they be fired in light of the fact that they have rights to be transferred?
I know a few guys right now, they got fired because they went working dust. They fighting right now to try to get their jobs back.
And they're reluctant to tell the employer because the employer, the last employer, is stuck with the workers' compensation. Is that right?
Yes.
And so if they can get fired before they get sick, when they might be sick, maybe they'll go somewhere else and somebody else will be responsible. Is that the danger?
Yes, sir. Because if you say something about it, the coal company can fire you before the government can do anything about it. You still got to wait for the government to do what they got to do to get your job back. Then you got to hire lawyers. How many coal miners can get lawyers to fight their cases?
Thank you. Now, President Roberts, you indicated protections that union members have that non-union members don't have in terms of worker protections in the contract. Can you explain what you meant?
Yes, although the law says certain things, to expect that a coal miner that doesn't have representation at the mine is going to exercise those rights, knowing full well that at some point in time, something could happen to him and he'd be discharged. They do not exercise that right, they being the miners at non-union mines. Our contract, as well as the law says, we can withdraw ourselves from any situation that we feel dangerous to our health or any situation that we feel that could injure us. And we exercise, we being our members, that on a frequent basis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
And thank you, Mr. Scott. We'll now recognize Mr. Griffith from Virginia. 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you very much. Let me thank you, Madam Chair, and Ranking Member Byrne, and my friend also from Virginia, the Chairman of the full committee, Mr. Scott, for inviting me to be a participant in this today. This is very important to the constituents in my district. I represent the part of the hotspot that was mentioned earlier is southwestern Virginia, and it is important. Mr. Hairston, I believe I heard you say that you got help from Washington Lee University School of Law. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And as a proud alumnus of that institution, I'm glad to know they're doing some good stuff. It's a good school, and they do a lot of good things.
They do a good lot.
And I have heard the same thing that you said, and your answers to Representative Scott, Chairman Scott, were the same as I've heard in the district, and that is people are afraid to go get the x-rays for fear that there'll be some other reason that they lose their job. So I'm intrigued because I want to find answers to this problem. I mean, I'm a big supporter of coal mining, but I want to make sure we take care of our miners. Mr. Watsman, you indicated that we should have a universal x-ray system. Do you think that might solve this fear problem? I mean, if everybody has to do it, and I will tell you, it's not an alien concept because my mother was a school teacher. And I forget how many years it was, but every 3 or 5 years, she had to go and get a chest x-ray make sure she didn't have tuberculosis because there was at one time a huge tuberculosis problem. So what seems to be the resistance to having everybody get an x-ray every so many years, and then that way you've got a better chance of being able to help people quicker? And it's not that somebody like Mr. Harrison be asking for the x-ray, everybody had to get it. And Mr. Roberts, I want your comment on that too. Mr. Watsman?
Well, that's what we believe should be the case, that every miner participates in the mandatory X-ray surveillance program. Will that address the concerns of discrimination and getting fired? I don't know the answer to that. What I do know is that that will provide information to the miner and to the employer so that they can work with them during the remainder of their working career to protect their health as best as possible.
And I appreciate that. Mr. Roberts, your thoughts, because I don't have an opinion per se. I'm just trying to learn here today.
Thank you. My view of this, and I believe that this will be the correct view, we do not necessarily have a problem with miners getting x-rays every 5, 6, whatever it might be, years. Our problem is that we do not think that coal companies should be privy to that information. We have a HIPAA law that says that no one can have my medical records, and we're going to say to the coal companies who've got a less than stellar record in some instances here, here you go, here's the x-rays from the people who are working. That is going to be something that miners will resist to no end. So I think we need to protect their privacy here.
And I'm going to look forward to thinking about that and trying to figure it out, because I also know that sometimes the miner, even if he has a problem, won't exercise his rights for the same fears that he didn't get in the x-ray for. Now, the other thing I thought was intriguing today, Mr. Watson, was this idea of the personal, let me see if I got it right here, the personal protective devices. I mean, I've got research from Virginia Tech and some researchers there have been working on it, and they agree with the silica issue, but they think there may be other factors as well, and every mountain's a little bit different. There are different minerals in every mine, and sometimes even the mines that aren't in Appalachia have high concentrations of minerals. But if we had a personal protection device, it seems to me, if that's not too heavy or burdensome, that would eliminate a lot of these concerns about whether it's coal, which we now think is not as bad as the silica, and I think that's right based on the science, and yet there's research ongoing about other things. You've said that's a good idea. You think the industry would accept that?
They're in selective instances, they're already being used voluntarily in the industry.
Okay.
These are
So
devices.
your answer is yes, because I'm running out of time.
The answer is yes.
Mr. Roberts, what do you think? Do you think the miner would be willing to do that? Because to me, that seems like a really practical solution.
It really depends on your job, Congressman. And let me give you an example,
Yes,
if
sir.
you don't mind. I ran a shuttle car in about 40 inches of coal, and you could touch the top as you went up to the miner to get it loaded. When you came back, you couldn't see anything on the other side because the coal was dragging on the top. You cannot put a shuttle car operator in an Airstream helmet and expect him to operate that shuttle car safely without running over top of somebody. If you're in other occupations in the mine, you cannot wear an Airstream helmet. It's impossible. There are some places you can, but in a lot of places you can't.
Well, and maybe we need research to figure out how to make those devices a little bit less intrusive. I will also tell you that one of the things that my tech folks said we might want to take a look at is, Virginia Tech folks said we might want to take a look at is the mine processing, getting the mine ready, because apparently the dust rules don't apply until you're actually mining the product, and yet you're digging through a lot of rock to get that seam ready to be mined. I'm out of time, so I yield back.
Thank you all very much for your testimony, and I want to thank all of the witnesses on panel one for your participation today. Certainly, I learned a lot myself, and certainly have a lot of compassion, Mr. Hairston, for what you have been through, and hopefully we will have an opportunity and we'll make a way to really provide some support. Members of the committee, that what we've heard is very valuable, and the committee may have some additional questions for you, and we ask the witnesses to please respond to the questions in writing. The hearing will be open for 14 days in order to receive the responses. I remind my colleagues that pursuant to committee practice, witness questions for the hearing record must be submitted to the majority committee staff or committee clerk within 7 days. The questions submitted must address the subject matter of the hearing. We're going to seat the second panel. Well, let's take 5 minutes to recess to seat the second panel. All right, thank you all very much. Good afternoon. Our first witness on the second panel will be Dr. John Howard. Dr. Howard is the director of the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. He's held that post since 2009. Dr. Howard previously served as director of OSHA from 2002 to 2008. Prior to coming to OSHA, Dr. Howard was chief of the Division of Occupation Safety and Health for the California Department of Industrial Relations, Labor, and Workforce Development. The next witness will be Dr. Zeteslo, Assistant Secretary for the Mine Safety and Health Administration. Prior to leading MISHA, Zeteslo was CEO of Rhino Resources, a Kentucky coal mine operator. He also served as chair of the Kentucky and Ohio Coal Associations. He's a native of West Virginian, and he started his career as a coal miner. Final witness is Ms. Cindy Brown Barnes, Director of Education, Workforce, and Income Security for the Government Accountability Office. Ms. Brown Barnes leads the GOA team that audited the Department of Labor's management of the Black Lung Disability Trust Fund. She has more than 30 years of experience performing audits of federal agencies. Welcome to all of our witnesses. We appreciate all of the witnesses for being here today. Look forward to your testimony. Let me remind the witnesses that we've read your written statements and they will appear in full in the hearing record.
Madam Chairwoman,
Yes.
I have a parliamentary inquiry.
Yes, sir. State your parliamentary inquiry.
I appreciate Ms. Barnes from the GO being here today, but it's my understanding that she'll speak on issues related to the funding of the Black Lung Disability Trust Fund, and that those issues are not within the jurisdiction of the committee. Do we have a responsibility to limit our hearings to subjects we can address in this committee, and allowing adequate time for the other issues?
GOA was invited to testify because the Black Lung Benefits Act falls squarely in the jurisdiction of this committee and this subcommittee, including the administration of the program by the Department of Labor. This subcommittee can conduct oversight of the tax rate and the trust fund solvency, even if we cannot legislate on the tax, as that falls in Ways and Means. Indeed, Chairman Scott and Ways and Means Chairman Neal are co-requesters of the work being performed by the GAO on the trust fund solvency. I want to remind everyone that the DOL Secretary is one of the 3 trustees of the Black Lung Benefits Disability Trust Fund, and GAO's testimony is addressing not only the tax, but the maladministration of self-insurance, the Office of Workers' Compensation Programs. As the minority is aware, the GAO work is still underway, but when it is complete, it may be timely to hold another hearing and ask OWCP to testify. However, GOA's work is not expected to be completed until the fall. And I would add that if the minority felt it was important to have testimony here today, the minority could have invited them to testify or made a request to the majority to consider an additional joint witness. However, our staff did not receive communication in reference to that.
Thank you for your response.
All right, thank you. Our final witness, I think I've just introduced her. Okay, all right. Thank you very much. We appreciate all the witnesses for being here today and look forward to your testimony. I do want to remind the witnesses that we have read your written statements and they will appear in full in the hearing record. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7D and committee practice, each of you is asked to limit your oral presentation to a 5-minute summary of your written statement. I want to remind the witnesses that pursuant to Title 18 of the U.S. Code, Section 1001, it is illegal to knowingly and willfully falsify any statement, representation, writing, document, or material fact presented to Congress, or otherwise conceal or cover up a material fact. Before you begin your testimony, please remember to push the button on the microphone in front of you so that it will turn on and the members can hear you. And as you begin to speak, the light in front of you will turn green. After 4 minutes, the light will turn yellow to signal that you have 1 minute remaining. When the light turns red, your 5 minutes have expired, and we ask that you please wrap up. We will let the entire panel make their presentations before we move to member questions. When answering a question, please remember once again to turn your microphone on. I will first recognize Dr. John Howard. Dr. Howard, you're recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Good morning, Chairwoman Adams and Ranking Member Byrne and distinguished members of the subcommittee. My name is John Howard, and I am the director of the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, or NIOSH, which is part of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. I'm here today to provide two brief updates. First, I'll provide an update on the science showing how inhaling respirable crystalline silica contributes to U.S. coal miners developing a lung disease called pneumoconiosis. And second, I will describe NIOSH's efforts to improve the technology for assessing coal miners' exposure to quartz, the form of crystalline silica found in coal mine dust. Quartz is the most common type of crystalline silica. During coal mining activities, rock that contains quartz can be disturbed, generating dust that contains respirable particles of crystalline silica, which miners then can inhale. We know that when miners in certain jobs, such as roof bolting, workers at the mine face, and surface miners engaged in drilling through layers of rock covering the coal seam can develop a lung disease called pneumoconiosis as a result of their inhalation. Specifically, miners can develop a type of pneumoconiosis called silicosis. Miners can also develop coal workers' pneumoconiosis, or black lung disease, mixed with silicosis. Science tells us that quartz plays a contributing role in the current outbreak of pneumoconiosis in coal miners, particularly in the central Appalachian region, which includes eastern Kentucky, western Virginia, and in West Virginia. In these areas, approximately 20% of active underground coal miners with 25 or more years of mining tenure have evidence of pneumoconiosis. We know this from several lines of evidence, including 1, radiographic exams performed during coal workers' health surveillance surveys, 2, Mine Safety and Health Administration inspection data, 3, interviews of coal miners with progressive massive fibrosis, and 4, analysis of coal workers' lung tissue. Timely monitoring of quartz would provide better protection for miners. As a first step, NIOSH is researching technologies to advance the science of assessing quartz exposures in the field, specifically developing and testing a prototype for a field-based rapid quartz monitor, which I have with me today, a type of self-assessment tool also known as an end-of-shift silica monitor. The rapid quartz monitoring prototype is based on 3 components: a sampler, an analyzer, and a quartz concentration software calculator. Concurrently, NIOSH is funding through its external contracts program the development of a standalone, near real-time, continuous quartz monitor for compliance sampling. Development and certification of the near real-time continuous quartz monitor for compliance sampling could take a decade or more, so it is not a near-term solution for assessing quartz exposure. Between 2016 and 2018, NIOSH conducted usability tests of the field-based prototype rapid quartz monitor, or end-of-shift silica monitor, in 4 coal mines in West Virginia, including 3 underground mines and 1 surface mine. The mines conducted the testing in collaboration with NIOSH, collecting more than 200 area and personal dust samples. During those tests, the method used to provide only an estimate for quartz. Still, the mines were able to use the information from the field test prototype rapid quartz monitor to assess the efficacy of a dust control technology, and were able to identify occupations and tasks characterized by exposure to high concentrations of quartz. At this time, NIOSH is supporting MSHA evaluations of the prototype to determine how well the results correlate with the analytical results provided by the standard laboratory-based MSHA P7 approach. Sampling will be conducted in MSHA Districts 2 and 3 and will be expanded to include samples from each MSHA district across the United States. Although the field-based prototype rapid quartz monitor, or end-of-shift silica monitor, shows promise as a self-assessment tool for exposure to quartz in coal mines, it is not currently ready for use as a compliance tool. In the meantime, more frequent quartz sampling, as opposed to dust itself, but quartz sampling, and more frequent enhanced medical surveillance would be appropriate, including retired coal miners. Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. We'll recognize Assistant Secretary Mr. Teslow. 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, ma'am. Chairwoman Adams, Ranking Member Byrne, members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me here to testify today. It's my honor to appear before this subcommittee and to represent President Trump, Secretary Costa, and all 1,860 dedicated men and women of the Mine Safety and Health Administration. What distinguishes MSHA from other federal safety agencies is our foundational mandate of inspecting every underground mine at least 4 times per year and every surface mine at least twice. I'm pleased to report that in 2018, MSHA fulfilled that mandate with over 37,000 inspections. Our One MSHA initiative began last year by creating the unified position of Administrator for Mine Safety and Health Enforcement. We evaluated all mines for distance from MSHA offices and identified 90 mines where it made sense to cross-train inspectors. The Mine Safety and Health Academy established and revised a curriculum with input from the NCFLL, which represents our field staff, and provided up to 56 hours of classroom training for those inspectors, plus 24 hours of on-the-job training with a seasoned inspector. During the 6 months beginning last October, inspectors with those 90 mines spent 41% less travel time than previously. Clearly, this saves taxpayer dollars, but ultimately this is about more effectively achieving MSHA's core mission. Instead of spending time driving, our inspectors can spend more time on site interacting with miners and observing. Understand that MSHA will retain specialists in their current roles to cover specific mining conditions, such as ventilation experts for underground coal mine inspections, which are prone to special hazardous conditions. In keeping with our promise to the House and Senate Appropriations Committees, MSHA's Office of Accountability will audit crossover mine inspections to ensure that enforcement personnel adhere to MSHA's policies and procedures. MSHA's injury and fatality data show the most common cause of fatalities is powered haulage accidents, accounting for half of fatalities in recent years. We launched an initiative focusing specifically on the 3 most common types of powered haulage fatalities, which are mobile equipment collisions, belt conveyors, and seatbelt use. Last June, we published a request for information seeking input on these technologies, practices, and other ways to prevent such fatalities, and held 7 public hearings along the way. In the recently released Spring Unified Agenda, MSHA announced our intention to issue a proposed rule addressing powered haulage. In addition to more strategically focusing on the day-to-day safety of miners, we're paying very close attention to the H in MSHA, which is miners' health. MSHA continues to aggressively enforce existing standards to ensure that miners are protected from exposure to respirable dust and quartz. I'm encouraged by mine operators' plus 99% compliance with the 2016 respirable dust coal rule and controlling coal miners' exposure to quartz. The number of quartz samples collected has increased by 335% between 2013 and 2018. And since August of 2016, MSHA samples indicate average quartz exposures are 75% below the threshold limit on average. This can further improve with real-time quartz monitoring, similar to CPDM technology, which NIOSH continues to develop along with MSHA's collaboration. Whereas over 16% of quartz samples exceeded the standard in 2008, only 1.2% exceeded that standard in 2018, which is the lowest rate since MSHA began keeping records. Samples that exceed the standard are reviewed in senior staff meetings. Field staff issue citations per regulations and follow up to ensure the mine addresses the cause to avoid future exceedances. And to compel compliance, we have not hesitated to issue 104B withdrawal orders. In addition, in the 2014 respirable coal mine dust rule, MSHA committed to a retrospective study of the dust rule, and last year we issued an RFI seeking comments on how best to study that structure that study. Due to the decades-long latency period between exposure and disease manifestation, a medically valid study cannot be completed in the near term. But MSHA anticipates the study will confirm that dramatic increases in sampling and compliance translate into reduced black lung incidents going forward. In May of 2019, MSHA published an RFI in its regulatory agenda that includes both coal and metal non-metal quartz or silica standards. In closing, I want to inform the subcommittee that MSHA is more vigorously pursuing operators who refuse to pay delinquent civil penalties. Shortly after I testified last February, we launched an enhanced scofflaw initiative, and I'm pleased to report that so far it has accounted for nearly $8 million that otherwise would not have been collected. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to discuss MSHA's important work with you. I look forward to answering any questions that members of the subcommittee may have.
Thank you very much. We'll recognize Ms. Brown Barnes for 5 minutes, ma'am.
Chairwoman Adams, Ranking Member Byrne, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to discuss our prior and ongoing work on the Black Lung Disability Trust Fund solvency and the Department of Labor's, or DOL's, oversight of the program. The Black Lung Benefits Program helps minors who have been totally disabled due to black lung disease. Coal companies found liable or the trust fund pays these benefits. The trust fund may pay if, for example, a company goes bankrupt. A domestic coal tax is the trust fund's primary funding source. Today I will discuss 1, the future insolvency of the trust fund given the coal tax decrease and declining coal production, and 2, provide preliminary observations regarding DOL's oversight given recent coal company bankruptcies. Last year, we reported that multiple factors have challenged the finances of the trust fund since it was established about 40 years ago. Its expenses have consistently exceeded its revenues, interest payments have grown, and actions taken that were expected to improve trust fund finances did not completely address this debt. As a result, the trust fund has borrowed from the Treasury almost every year since 1979. This caused debt and interest to accumulate. Trust fund revenue will further be challenged by the 55% coal tax decrease that took effect this year and by declining coal production into the future. We did simulations that demonstrate that future trust fund revenue may not be sufficient to cover beneficiary payments and administrative costs through 2050. For example, we simulated that trust fund revenues for this year would be $187 million less than last year due to the coal tax decrease. As a result, the trust fund would need to continue borrowing from the Treasury to cover its expenses. When this occurs, the federal government is essentially borrowing from itself and from the general taxpayer to fund its benefit payments to coal miners with black lung disease. As you can see in the figure, by 2050, our simulation shows that outstanding debt could exceed $15 billion. Even if the Black Lung program stopped paying all beneficiaries this year, the debt could still be over $6 billion by 2050 using the current coal tax rate. However, various options such as adjusting the coal tax and forgiving interest or debt could reduce future borrowing and improve the trust fund's financial position. Our preliminary observations indicate that trust fund finances have been further strained by coal operator bankruptcies. Since 2014, insolvent coal miners companies have cost the trust fund over $300 million. Federal law charges the DOL with ensuring that coal companies have insurance to secure their black lung benefit liabilities. To do so, companies can insure, meaning they must obtain acceptable collateral in an amount deemed adequate by DOL to secure their liability. As you can see in the table, since 2014, there have been 3 bankruptcies of large self-insured coal operators that have resulted in substantial losses to the trust fund. For example, the collateral DOL required from Alpha Natural Resources was just $12 million, although the estimated liability was about $207 million. As a result, an estimated 685 beneficiaries will be added to the trust fund with an estimated loss of nearly $185 million. There are 22 remaining coal operators that DOL has authorized to self-insure, and many of these pose a financial risk to the trust fund. Our preliminary analysis indicates that DOL did not regularly review these operators so that it could adjust collateral as needed to protect the trust fund. For 10 of these companies, the last review occurred between 16 and 31 years ago. For 11 of these companies, DOL has no estimate of their black lung liability. For companies that DOL did have liability estimates for, in some cases, the collateral was tens of millions less than their estimated liability. In 2015, DOL stopped monitoring these self-insured coal companies. Over the past 4 years, DOL has been developing new procedures for regulating self-insurance, but these procedures have not yet been put into action. In conclusion, the future solvency of the trust fund remains bleak, and DOL's oversight challenges have left the trust fund vulnerable and exposed to additional financial risks from insolvent coal mine operators without adequate collateral. Our ongoing work will present opportunities for us to further examine these issues. Thank you. This concludes my prepared statement, and I'd be happy to entertain any questions.
Thank you very much. Under Committee Rule 8, we will now question witnesses under the 5-minute rule. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Dr. Howard, in 1974, NIOSH recommended reducing the permissible exposure limit for silica to 50 milligrams per cubic meter from 100 milligrams. Is that still the position?
Yes.
So there are are there any credible policy justifications for reducing the standard at OSHA as was done in 2016? And what's your response to that?
We stand by our recommendations that were made many years ago. We were very fortunate that OSHA finally accepted our recommendations and issued a silica rule. And we work closely with MSHA if they choose to develop a silica rule.
So is there excessive risk to miners at and below the current 100 microgram per cubic meter threshold?
We certainly believe that any exposure to quartz is not a healthful thing.
So what about 50?
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Okay. Mr. Secretary, what about that? Is there any good reason why OSHA should have one silica standard and MSHA should have another that's half as protective?
Well, Madam Chairman, the laws are very different. While OSHA's silica standard, for those of you that are familiar with it, recognizes the use of personal protective equipment, or PPE, MSHA's specifically does not allow it for any terms of compliance. And additionally, the average micrograms per cubic meter has been at just slightly over 25 micrograms. The standard is at 100, as it has been from the inception of this legislation. The biggest issue in here is the prohibition against counting personal protective equipment.
So Armand,
So OSHA, what I'm trying to say is that OSHA's standard, while it is lower, it is achieved through the use of PPE. MSHA's standard is not allowed to count PPE.
okay, so are miners somehow less susceptible to silica-related disease than construction workers?
I'm sorry?
Are miners less susceptible to silica-related disease than construction workers?
They are not, and that's exactly why we enforce that law very regularly, very rigidly. We're up 80% on quartz inspections and quartz sampling in the last 10 years, and I will tell you that every quartz sample is taken by MSHA, not by the industry.
Okay, you've been quoted in the past as saying that MPF cases are clearly silica problems, and other times you said that you don't think the science of causation is well defined. Which is it?
I think PMF problems are largely contributed to by quartz, of which silica is a component. Silica is a component of quartz. What we actually measure is quartz.
So, okay, Dr. Howard, do you agree with the Assistant Secretary's statement? What's your view?
Well, I've said that in my testimony that quartz is the most common form of crystalline silica.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to now recognize the ranking member for the purpose of questioning the witnesses. You recognize, Mr. Byrne.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Secretary Zetezalo, I'm glad to see you're moving forward with a formal request for information on respirable crystalline silica. As we've discussed here today, the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health is working on an end-of-shift measuring device, and there's additional research underway on advanced lung diseases related to mining activities. What type of information from the public do you hope to gain in the request for information?
What I hope to gain from the public in this RFI is some alternative means of using PPE to achieve a lower compliance rate, or a lower threshold rate. The people that make Airstream helmets have now discontinued that. I can tell you of mines today that are using Airstream helmets voluntarily that in the future will not be able to. There are a number of different PPE providers, some of which we've been aware of, some of which we have not. So it's really the science of PPE, and its current state is very critical to achieving a lower standard as we go forward in the future. As Cecil Roberts stated, not all miners can easily wear PPE depending on their job. So it's important that we actually have some good definition around that. What I hope to achieve in that is the segregation of a court standard, as well as current information to enable us to make informed decisions. And we released that on May 22nd.
As we heard from Mr. Roberts earlier, there's real concern about the issue of tampering with dust samples. As MSHA is tasked with enforcing the laws and regulations impacting mining operations, how does MSHA currently ensure there is no tampering with the data collected from continuous personal dust monitors?
CPTMs offer a lot of tamper-proof improvements. For example, if the unit sits still too long, if it is hung somewhere, its functionality is obviated, it immediately voids the sample. So it's very good from that aspect. It can't be moved out of the way completely. The second thing that we do is that data is transmitted electronically from the unit directly to MSHA. So there's no interpretation, there's no interference. And thirdly, one of the more important things is that those units give people, machine operators and miners, real-time data on what they're actually exposed to. And this is critical to them being able to make adjustments in how they cut and how they work throughout the shift.
You noted in your testimony that the agency recently examined injury and fatality data to determine the most common causes of mining fatalities. Can you expand on the findings in this area and the ongoing initiatives MSHA has launched as a result?
Certainly, sir. The most common cause of mining fatalities has been powered haulage for the past several years. Powered haulage is especially onerous, and it's one of those events that whereas it's very low probability, it is very high consequence. These large pieces of equipment are very unforgiving when you collide with them or when you have an interaction with them. So we did an RFI to make sure that we knew what all the best technologies were out there, because our laws are very archaic in this regard, in that we essentially require when a big truck goes into reverse that it emits a beep, 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 beep sound, and that's it. And that hasn't, I don't think, changed since 1974-ish, and I could be wrong on that. Maybe it was 72, but I think it was 74. There are new technologies out there today, such as proximity detection, such as alarms, sensors on your vehicles, such as cameras, that enable operators to actually see what's going on around them. That is the largest single cause, and that's what we are addressing. Some other things that we had last year, we had a very severe rash of fire incidents on large pieces of equipment. Those incidents provoked us to go ahead and do a complete inspection of all trucks in the mining industry. We inspected over 4,000 trucks and went through all the fire suppression on those, worked with operators to make sure that they were up to speed. Several of them had been installed incorrectly. So we're trying to do that in a lot of ways as a compliance assistance program to make sure that people actually can benefit from what we're doing rather than just receive citations.
Thank you. Yield back, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you very much. I'll now yield to the gentleman from California, Mr. Takano. 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for coming to this hearing today as we work towards ensuring safety standards for our miners. As we all know, progressive massive fibrosis is a debilitating and deadly disease. The levels of this disease have increased over the past 25 years and do not show signs of abating. This is a health epidemic, and we need to act now. We've got convincing scientific evidence to indicate that. The lives of minors are at stake. We cannot wait another decade to address silica exposure. We already have the data and information available to us now. Assistant Secretary Zatezalo, when you were before this committee in 2018, you stated that you were waiting for a report from the National Academy of Sciences, and that report was released a year ago. Please explain to members of this committee and to the minors that MSHA is charged with protecting why you've not updated the standards.
We have not updated the standards, sir, because when I took this oath of office to come in here, I promised that I would obey the laws, and part of them include the Administrative Procedures Act, sir.
What does that have to do? You said that you would after receiving the National Academy of Sciences report, that was the key thing you were waiting for.
We are working on the National Academy of Sciences report along with NIOSH, and we've worked tirelessly on it since we began. We have increased our sampling. We have lowered the average exposure, and we continue to do that every day.
Well,
however,
we'll get
I do
more,
have
we'll get more into
procedures I
what
have
that
to go
report
through.
says. Reclaiming my time, sir. You know, you said that you were collecting data on quartz and not silica. Dr. Howard, explain the difference between quartz and silica to me.
Well, I'm not a mineralogist, but silica, crystalline silica, is the most common form of quartz we find in a coal mine.
So saying that he was collecting silica, quartz samples and not silica seems to me a distinction that doesn't make a difference.
Potato, potato.
Thank you. Thank you. I find that testimony, you know, highly, highly deceptive, Mr. Zuckerman.
It's not deceptive at all, sir.
You think there is a difference between quartz and silica?
There is a difference between quartz and silica. Quartz is made up of anywhere from 60 to 98% silica. Quartz and silica are two different things.
I see. Okay.
We use measuring.
Reclaiming my
quartz as a
time,
proxy.
sir. Let me ask my next question. You know, the Mine and Safety and Health Administration is failing miners. Inspecting underground mines only 4 times a year does not help miners. I mean, you talked about how you're inspecting mines. Refusing to implement new technology does not help miners. The slow walking and delaying of updating standards does absolutely nothing to help miners. We are out of time. MSHA needs to address the standards now. Over a year ago, the National Academy of Sciences recommended the use of end-of-shift silica monitoring technology, and Dr. Howard just described their development of affordable technology that enables mines to conduct end-of-shift monitoring of miners' silica exposure. What are your plans to require that this technology be used?
Sir, that technology is not for compliance, and it will not withstand the scrutiny of a system that has to be used for compliance and enforcement. It is an engineering tool, not a compliance tool.
Okay, well, let's switch quick. I want to know if...
We do not prevent anyone from using.
I want to know if you can explain, with all the work that NIOSH, OSHA, and the National Academy of Sciences and MSHA have done regarding the hazards of silica over the last 40 years, why you are starting the process with a request for information, the RFI, the earliest baby step of the regulatory process, rather than going directly to a formal proposal.
It's the process that I understand I'm required to follow, sir.
It's my understanding that you don't have to start with an RFI, that you could go directly to a formal proposal, given all the information we already have.
Given that the average exposure is already half of what OSHA's limit is, it would seem to me that an emergency standard would be uncalled for.
Okay, all right. Well, I think that we have an ample amount of information already, as I cited. Should Congress amend the Act to make a knowing violation of mandatory safety and health standard, which recklessly endangers the health of or safety of a minor, a felony?
I don't understand your question.
Should Congress amend the Mine Act to make a knowing violation of a mandatory safety and health standard, which recklessly endangers the health or safety of a minor, a felony?
As I've said to you last year, sir, that is Congress's discretion.
Today, as you know, it's a mere misdemeanor. Would that deter much such conduct as we saw in the Upper Big Branch mine where 29 miners were killed on April 5th, 2010?
Difficult for me to say that, sir.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your testimony. I yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Klein, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank the witnesses for being here. The mining industry contributes greatly to our economy and to our energy security, and as we know, miners have made many sacrifices, and it's important that we support them. Industry has been making changes to better protect and monitor the health of their miners, and we should be looking for ways to further encourage this. In my home district, Washington and Lee School of Law has an advanced administrative litigation clinic for black lung. This clinic assists coal miners and survivors who are pursuing federal black lung benefits. The clinic has represented roughly 200 clients since being established in 1996 and has a success rate of 5 times the national average. I'm glad that my district and this committee are putting a focus on ways to better protect miners. I would first begin by asking Mr. Watsman, can you speak to the technologies that are being used to better monitor dust? Oh, I'm sorry. Assistant Secretary Zetezolo. I apologize.
Sorry.
Can you please speak to the cross-training and consolidation efforts on the coal mine safety and health inspectors and the metal, non-metal mine safety and health inspectors? As this number of active mines has decreased over the years, do these changes keep pace with what is needed, and has there been any input from industry on this consolidation?
The crossover inspections that we started last year, sir, were entered into as a way to allow inspectors, at inspectors' suggestion, that allow inspectors to spend more time at mines and less traveling in their vehicles. I told you in my opening testimony that in the first 6 months, it has now saved about 41% of the time. The question with it was really the crossover training. All of these people are inspectors in the classic sense. They're experienced, they know what they're doing, but they need to brush up on the laws and differences in them. So with that regard, we put them through a 56-hour program. We went through it with the union. We did a 24-hour site-on-site, boots-on-the-ground together transfers, and it seems to be going very smoothly from an inspectorate standpoint and from the operator standpoint. Now, we have revised our training. We have taken some points on board from our crossover inspectors and from our NCFLL union folks. We have revised that. We're very fortunate that we have our own Mine Safety and Health Academy, and we put that training on ourselves. And I think it's going fairly well right now. We are probably going to do a little wider swath on that in the future. I will point out to you that we will not reduce the role of specialists, and we have not crossed over underground hazardous mines at all. We will not jeopardize those. What we cross over on is primarily sand and gravel operations, stone pits, that sort of stuff.
You've gotten a pretty good, as you say, you've gotten a pretty good feedback on that from the inspectors?
We have good feedback from the inspectors, and I have specifically asked a number of operators about it. We've had fair to medium impact, I'll put it that way. I'm actually going to speak to a group in Indiana in a few weeks, and I'm going to ask them those questions again.
Great. Thank you very much. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much. We will now yield 5 minutes to the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Weil.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Greetings, and thank you for being here on this, what I consider to be a very, very important issue. By way of background, I represent a district in Pennsylvania, and I practiced law for 30-some years, and often saw clients who were victimized by lack of insurance by a party on the other side or inadequate insurance. So this is something that causes me a great deal of concern. Ms. Burns, you noted that many mine operators are underinsured for black lung liability. And we know that a group of mine operators recently filed for bankruptcy and were able to shift over $300 million of liability to the Black Lung Trust Fund. All of this is happening while the excise tax rate on coal that funds the Black Lung Trust Fund was reduced. In order to avoid purchasing workers' compensation insurance, mine operators may self-insure if they demonstrate to the Department of Labor that they have the necessary assets to cover their black lung liabilities. Am I right about that?
Yes, that's correct.
What documentation does the Department of Labor require to confirm that mine operators have sufficient assets to cover such liabilities so that they can self-insure?
Well, this is what we've been trying to get a clear answer on as part of our ongoing work. And they're in the process now of revising those procedures. So we'll have a better answer once we complete our assessment.
Well, to date, what kind of documentation has been required by the department in order to ensure that a mine operator can properly cover its liabilities in the event it chooses to self-insure?
Yeah, it's varied, and it's been rather sketchy, and there's been some difficulty obtaining that documentation.
Okay. Are there any kinds of audits done of the documentation that's provided?
That's part of what they're trying to implement currently, to do some audits of that.
Okay, well, as I said, the self-insured situations cause me a great deal of concern. In the context of the recent bankruptcies, particularly Alpha Natural Resources, do you think the Department of Labor was unaware of the disproportionate lack of reserves before approving it to self-insure?
In terms of whether they were aware or unaware, one thing that we've noticed is that they have not been overseeing it, and that's been part of the problem, monitoring it and looking, checking on it periodically to see what's going on there.
So let me just shift to the Assistant Secretary, if I may, on this same issue, same area. Was the Department of Labor unaware of the disproportionate lack of reserves before approving Alpha Natural to self-insure?
Ma'am, MSHA has no role in the Federal Black Lung Trust Fund. It's my understanding that's guaranteed by the U.S. Treasury, but MSHA actually has no role in the Federal Black Lung Trust Fund.
So if we refuse to raise the excise tax rate back to its 2008 to 2018 levels, and if the Black Lung Trust Fund goes insolvent, the Department of Labor is going to have to borrow money from the U.S. Treasury. Is that right? Either one of you?
That's the way I understand it.
And Ms. Barnes, is that
Yes,
your
that's
understanding? So in effect, we would be shifting the cost of the Black Lung Trust Fund away from the coal operators and to the taxpayers, right?
Yes.
It's my understanding also that according to SEC filings, Alpha Natural Resources CEO pocketed over $20 million in the 3 years leading up to their bankruptcy, and after the company exited bankruptcy in 2016, he was paid another $1.8 million in compensation. Is that your understanding as well?
I have no involvement in that, no knowledge of
Are
it.
you aware of that, Ms. Barnes?
I was not.
That's a pretty outrageous situation, wouldn't you say?
That is a cause for concern.
Thank you. That's all I have. I yield back.
Thank you. I want to now recognize the chair of the subcommittee, the chair of the Education and Labor Committee, Mr. Scott from Virginia. Scott, you're recognized.
Thank you. Mrs. Teslow, we sent you several oversight letters about the situation where Affinity Mine had been put on a pattern of violation sanction, and even after, for serious violations, including some that involved minors' deaths, and that sanction was lifted. Our concern was it didn't appear to be consistent with the statutory requirements that they have complete inspections without serious violations. We sent you letters to kind of follow up to see what had happened, and we got responses, and I want to thank you for the responses, but it didn't address the point we were trying to get to, and that is how Affinity Mines could have been relieved from sanctions. And so I'm asking you if we can get emails, memos leading up to the decision to remove Affinity Mine from the POV, communications with external parties leading up to the decision, and a list of meetings and copies of meetings or memos summarizing meetings between MSHA and Pocahontas Coal, the owner of Infinity Mines, regarding that decision. Would that be a problem in getting that information from you?
Sir, I believe that you're aware that that is the subject of a lawsuit that the UMWA filed on us that's currently open in the district court in Southern West Virginia. We have sent to you, I believe, a 52-page response and I think a 32, I
appreciate the
page
response.
And further information, I will be happy to make available to you any information that we file with the court. As such, sir, we're represented by the Department of Justice, and we will be happy to provide you everything that we file with the court.
And that's what we got, was just court filings and not copies of emails and other things that could have helped us understand how they got relieved of those sanctions.
It is under litigation, sir. I'm sorry that I
I-
can't speak to you more frankly about it.
I understand, but we'd like to get that information. Mr. Howard, we've heard about the difference between OSHA and MSHA on the silica standard. When was the silica standard first recommended by NIOSH?
Oh, I think it was 42, 43 years ago, sometime in the early 70s.
And finally, in 2016, OSHA adopted that standard?
Yes, as the former Secretary of Labor said, better late than never.
Well, is there any reason why MSHA cannot implement the same standard?
Well, I don't speak for MSHA, sir.
Well, you've recommended it to, for
Certainly have
MSHA?
made a recommendation to that effect.
Okay. You mentioned a monitor of retired mine workers.
I did.
What
Sir,
do you mean there?
as you well know, and it's not just the mining industry, but in any hazardous industry where there are exposures that occur that could result in adverse health effects, oftentimes the workers will leave the workforce. And we lose the ability, although if we do a special study of retired workers, but we often lose the ability to follow up in these long latency diseases in which the manifestations or the severity of the manifestations may not occur while the individual is employed. And then they go and they leave, and we lose track of following the full picture, characteristics of the disease. So I think one of the recommendations that we think is appropriate is to look at the medical surveillance, not just of the worker who's working, but rather to follow them in retirement or in an abrupt type of retirement where they have to leave because of illness.
Thank you. Ms. Brown-Barnes, the ranking members had expressed concerns about the jurisdiction of matters and whether we have jurisdiction over the tax. But the fact of the matter is, if the trust fund goes broke or doesn't have sufficient funds, that the general fund of the U.S. government will pay the benefits. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And the problem is, if the money's not there and we stop appropriating the money, then the workers may be without benefits. Who estimates the amount that the mine owners have to put up as collateral?
Department of Labor does that, OWCP.
And as your testimony, your written testimony points out, several of those businesses are putting up way under 10% of what the expected liability is. Is that right?
Yes.
Do you have an estimate about how much underfunding, potential underfunding there is?
I don't have a complete estimate because the department doesn't have an estimate, but we know from at least our preliminary work that it's at least tens of millions of dollars.
Tens of?
Millions.
Millions or billions?
Millions.
Okay. Now, but there are a lot of businesses, many businesses for which you had no estimate at all for their potential liability. Is that right?
Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to hear now from Mr. Griffin of Virginia. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. And as I indicated earlier, I'm not normally on this committee, and I'm very appreciative of the committee for allowing me to participate. Let's pick up with the fund, since that's where Chairman Scott ended. You indicated in your testimony that if we had no more claims, the debt would continue to rise on this, and that's because of old debt and interest payments. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes, that's correct.
And you also said that one of the things we might be able to do, because a lot of the companies that were responsible did go bankrupt, one of the things you indicated we might be able to do would be to forgive interest or part of the debt, that might help stabilize the fund as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, we did present options in our work from last year, and it did have some of those considerations that we laid out.
Because one of the things that my current coal operators tell me is that if they just had to pay for the responsibilities of what they had now, as opposed to paying for the mines that are no longer, or the mining companies that are no longer around, they believe that a reasonable number could be achieved and reached without a whole lot of gnashing of teeth and wailing going on. Do you concur in that opinion, or do you have no opinion?
It depends, and it depends on the underlying assumptions that's based on.
Okay. And I appreciate that, but I do think it's something we should continue to work on. Assistant Secretary, we heard earlier from one of our miners, and he's still here, and he said something about tape at one point in his testimony, and I'm wondering, you indicated that the machines measuring the dust and so forth were better today, but I've had miners tell me, even if they weren't asked to by the company, because they were afraid the mine might go out of business, they would put tape over the sensors on the monitors. Does the new equipment have the ability to thwart those types of efforts?
Yes, sir. The new equipment senses any kind of tampering, lack of movement, lower than expected dust, and it will void the sample and communicate that electronically at the end of the shift.
So if it's lower than expected, would that be, how is that measured?
Well,
is that measured real time, or is it over like every hour?
It's in real time. It's a continuous monitor. It provides, and I'm going to tell you, NIOSH did a great job getting this developed and out there, and I hope they're successful with the quartz monitor. But all right. The machine senses when somebody's trying to tamper with it, and it will void itself if it senses that.
All right.
And
now,
we also sample with a parallel system, sir, that is a gravimetric system. Our samples are not tampered with by anybody. They're under the supervision of MSHA.
All right. So we've gotten into this whole controversy over OSHA standards, NIOSH, and MSHA, and you indicated earlier that you all could not count the same way that OSHA does because you weren't allowed to count PPEs as being equipment that could be used. Why is that, and how do I fix it?
It's a nuance, sir, of the mining law. PPE is not allowed to count towards compliance.
So what you're saying to me is get a bill. Am I correct in that?
Yes, sir. There are people that use PPE, but it does not count towards their compliance.
All right. And then is there something we need to do to get more technology on the PPEs? Because if it's too cumbersome to wear in certain parts of the mine, got to be ways that we can make it less cumbersome with our space-age technology?
I think there is, and that's why we're out for an RFI on that very subject.
Okay. And explain that to me. What are you doing in the RFI on that subject?
An RFI is the request
for information. But what are you doing on it? What are you
from all the providers. We're gathering information from all the providers, and we'll see if there's acceptable ways we can go about this.
Because it would seem to me we ought to be able to make that a much simpler process. And as I said before, we've got the silica problem we know about, we've got the coal we know about, but there's also, in every mountain's a little different, and we've got different substances out there, and instead of trying to chase the different substances, it seems to me if we give clean air to the miners, we're solving a lot of problems and maybe even reducing costs over time. You agree?
I think that's correct, and I think that's been the wonderful thing that's been shown about CPDM is that when you get that information on their actual exposures into the hands of the operators and the people that are actually there running machinery and doing the work, they will manage that correctly. That's why we're at plus 99% compliance, sir. So I think any time to the extent that people are educated on that and that people have the immediacy of feedback, I think they will manage that process very well.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you. I want to yield now 5 minutes to Dr. Fox, North Carolina, who is ranking member of the committee.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today. Assistant Secretary Zeteslow, can you explain the difference between the primary functions and mission of your agency, the Mine Safety and Health Administration, and the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health? Additionally, how do the agencies currently collaborate, and how do you think they could better work together in the future on eliminating black lung disease?
Yes, ma'am, thank you. We are two disparate agencies. The MSHA agency is primarily enforcement, education. Those are our primary goals. We also have a tech support arm that does a lot of our laboratory work. NIOSH, on the other hand, and Dr. Howard may wish to clarify this, NIOSH is sort of the R&D side. MSHA does not do R&D. We do not develop technologies. That's all done through NIOSH, and we collaborate very well together. I have been to NIOSH's facilities. They have been to ours. We meet frequently. Several of his people are here with us today. I think our working relationship is very good, and I think we share a lot of commonality in goals. So I'll ask Dr. Howard if he'd care to add anything to that.
Certainly, I would echo that. I think our collaboration is excellent. I thank the Assistant Secretary for his enthusiasm to work with us. I think we work really well together, both on the leadership level as well as the staff level.
Well, thank you both. Again, Assistant Secretary Zeteslow, the last time you appeared before the committee, you indicated you were working on visiting all of your agency's field offices, and it's good to hear today that you were able to accomplish this goal. What was your biggest takeaway from those visits?
My biggest takeaway is what a great group of people that we have, what a great bunch we have at MSHA. We have, and you know, these lung issues are things that we very much care about. Almost all of MSHA's employees, inspectors, and people in the field, they are all miners, ex-miners. They live this every day, and they live in these communities. And I think we have a really great group of people. A lot of them would like to see more frequent communication. Several of them have complained to me about specific things, and I've tried to alleviate those where we could. But I guess what I was most impressed with is what a great group of serious people we have, how dedicated they are.
Thank you for that. One more question. I'm glad to hear you recognize the importance and benefits of compliance assistance visits, especially for smaller mine operators. Under your leadership, how are you encouraging more operators to take advantage of this opportunity?
Well, what we are doing is building up our program in certain areas. Unfortunately, over the years, mining tends to shift around the different parts of the country. And so we found ourselves with areas where there were a lot of miners and not enough EFS, MS, or our field people in the education side. We are moving some people in there. We've put some more people in there, and we will. Our compliance visits and compliance sessions last year were up over 8%. We conduct a lot of training, especially on the CPDM. We conduct all the training for certification on the CPDM throughout the industry. And we just have a lot of people that are out there hustling, trying to get around as much as they can. The Small Mine Services Group subset has been especially effective, and I'm very pleased with what we're seeing out of those groups.
Thank you, and thank you all again, and thank you, Madam Chairman. I yield back, or Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Fox. The chair was called to vote in the Financial Services Committee, and so I'll close up. I remind our colleagues that pursuant to committee practice, materials for submission for the hearing must be submitted to the committee clerk within 14 days following the last day of the hearing, preferably in Microsoft Word format. Materials must address the subject matter of the hearing. Only a member of the committee or an invited witness may submit materials for inclusion in the hearing record. Documents have to be in the form, the requisite form. So I want to thank the witnesses for your participation today. What we've heard today is extremely valuable. Members of the committee may have some additional questions for you, and we ask the witnesses to please respond to those in writing. The hearing record will be held open for 14 days in order to receive those responses. I remind my colleagues that pursuant to committee practice, witness questions for the hearing must be submitted to the majority committee staff within 7 days. The question submitted must address the subject matter of the hearing. I now recognize the distinguished ranking member for his closing statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think you will be an adequate substitute for Chairwoman Adams. And I want to thank everybody on this panel and the prior panel. I think we've had an excellent day discussing these very, very important issues, and the information that you and the previous panel have supplied to us will be very valuable as the committee makes its decisions about what, if any, actions we need to take. But what I'd really like to do is address the miners that are here today, and perhaps miners that are looking at us from other places. Mining is a very important part of the American economy, but mining doesn't happen without the people that do it. And miners are important people because you help drive the American economy. Now, it's a dangerous thing to mine, we know that. And what we've been talking about today are things that perhaps we can do, all of us working together, to make things safer and healthier for our miners who are so important to our economy and to our country. I think everybody up here, regardless of party designation, cares deeply for what we can do to make sure that we can make people safe and keep them safe and healthy. That's in everybody's interest. I'm also worried about preserving jobs in mining. We've had a real downturn in jobs in mining. In the previous administration, we almost had a war in a certain area of mining, coal mining. And we need to be all about trying to preserve jobs, not kill jobs. So I hope that we'll be concerned about that too, and understand just how valuable mining is and has been to America for generations. So I take our responsibility very seriously, our responsibility to you and to future generations of miners. You will continue to do what you do so very well, and that is a big part of what makes America great. So thank you for what you do. We're going to continue to look out for you and for those that follow you, because you're the most important part of mining. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. And I want to thank the witnesses for providing us with their valuable expertise. I want to thank the members of the subcommittee for your participation, and I note the presence and interest of my colleague from Virginia, Mr. Griffith. Thank you for being with us today. I think I can speak for all of them and say we've learned an enormous amount of valuable information from the witness today. We've heard compelling evidence that the most serious forms of black lung disease are again on the rise. We know what can be done about it, and we know that MMSHA should be doing more to save lives of our nation's miners from this terrible, preventable disease. We've also heard strong evidence about the growing indebtedness of the Black Lung Disability Trust Fund and the Labor Department's failure to oversee the self-insurance program, shifting more and more of the liability for black lung disease from the companies that caused the problem to the taxpayers. I think we can all agree that the work performed by our nation's courageous coal miners should not be cursed by the scourge of this dreaded occupational disease that we know can be prevented. They deserve safe working conditions and a long, healthy retirement. I finally ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a letter from the United Mine Workers of America and the United Steelworkers of America to the Assistant Secretary of Labor, and correspondence to and from the Assistant Secretary in request to information about the Pocahontas Coal Company Affinity Mine being relieved of its sanction under the relieved of their sanctions. We will pursue that, Mrs. Tezio, and to get better answers than we've gotten. If there's no further business, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.